When we hear the words Cyclopean Walls, we think about Bronze Age Greece and Cusco in Peru, but there are actually many ancient Cyclopean walls all over the world, and I'm particularly intrigued by those in the central Mediterranean. Sometimes also referred to as polygonal walls, there are dozens of them on mainland Italy, some of which I've covered on my channel, and 2 sites in Sicily also have them. I've been to one of these sites, the archaeological park in Giardini Naxos, so last week I decided to go to the other one that's high up on the rock that overlooks the town of Cefalù. These megalithic Cyclopean walls are somewhat of a mystery because there's a lot of speculation as to who built them and when. They are usually attributed to the classical era, but their strong resemblance to older megalithic structures, such as those in Mycenaean Greece, has people wondering if there might be a connection. At Cefalù, the information plaque in front of the Cyclopean site offers up some tantalizing statements. It talks about a link with Bronze Age Egypt, it talks about an alignment with the planet Venus, it talks about the monument being a place of water worship, and it talks about a Neolithic dolmenic structure that's hidden within the site. In this video, I deconstruct the information on this plaque and look at all the other research on this beautiful and atmospheric monument. So before we go to Cefalù, here's a quick summary of the mystery in case you haven't seen my other videos. If you have, feel free to skip ahead using the chapters. The Cyclopean walls on the Italian Peninsula are attributed to the Romans. They are at sites which the Romans did inhabit and form parts of structures that are typically Roman, such as villas, roads, and fortifications. This is one of the Cyclopean walls that encloses the Acropolis at Alatri, a beautiful hilltop town in the Lazio region of Italy. The gateway that you can see is called the Porta Maggiore and is on the south side of the town. This photograph shows Cyclopean masonry that forms a circuit around the village of Castel San Pietro close to Palestrina, which also has several polygonal walls. Castel San Pietro is higher up the mountain than Palestrina, and on the way back down, I noticed a small section of Cyclopean masonry at the side of the road that probably formed a much more complete second line of defense originally. What's strange about the whole thing is that Cyclopean masonry is not found in Rome itself, and the Romans, even though they wrote about their construction techniques, did not write about these polygonal walls. They are almost always found alongside more traditional Roman construction techniques, such as opus quadratum, opus isodomum, opus reticulatum, and opus incertum. So some people say maybe the Romans built upon earlier structures. I did read an explanation for their absence in Rome as being because most walls there are made of volcanic tuff, which is too soft to be cut into polygonal blocks. Legend has it that these walls on mainland Italy were built by a Bronze Age Aegean pre-Greek culture called the Pelasgians, although whether this particular culture existed or not isn't certain. So that would mean that before, or maybe even during the time that the Mycenaean palace civilization flourished in the Aegean, another group from that region somehow influenced building techniques on the Italian peninsula, whether through cultural exchange, trading posts, or colonies. However, there's no evidence that an Aegean presence was established there before the classical period. Furthermore, although there was some trade between mainland Italy and the Aegean during the Bronze Age, there's nothing to suggest that prior to the Romans, the tribes living on mainland Italy had the social organization to build fortified settlements using Cyclopean architecture, even if they had got the idea from some Pelasgian visitors. So that's the story with the mainland. Moving on to Sicily, one of the Cyclopean sites, Naxos, is a former Greek colony that was part of Magna Graecia. Magna Graecia was the name given to the south part of the Italian peninsula and parts of Sicily by ancient writers because those areas had been settled by Greek-speaking people from the Aegean during classical antiquity. These Greek settlements were not entirely homogeneous in their cultural expression because they consisted of colonies from different parts of the Aegean and were also established at different times over several hundred years. But overall, the area inhabited by these colonists starting in the 8th century BCE is called Magna Graecia. Most of the places where the Cyclopean walls are found on the Italian peninsula are not in locations that became part of Magna Graecia. However, on Sicily, one of the sites is at an ancient Greek settlement. The other Cyclopean site, Cefalù, is a native sickle site that was heavily influenced by the Greek presence on the island. This Hellenization of native groups was pretty common on Sicily at the time. The problem with attributing these two sets of Cyclopean walls on Sicily to the Greeks during classical antiquity is that such masonry wasn't a feature of the Aegean then. Examples of Cyclopean masonry there date back to the Bronze Age and more specifically to the structures built by the Mycenaeans. Plus, if they were built by the classical Greeks or as a result of Greek influence, why are there only two sites like this on the whole island, even though there were more than 50 Greek city-states or Hellenized native settlements at that time on Sicily? Just as with the Italian Peninsula, if we tried to find a Bronze Age explanation for these walls, the evidence simply isn't there. However, the argument is a little bit stronger for Sicily than the mainland because the Bronze Age settlement of Thapsos near Syracuse was found to be full of Mycenaean ceramics and artifacts when it was excavated. Furthermore, the layout of the town and the houses was distinctly Mycenaean. Some scholars argue that Thapsos was heavily influenced by Mycenaean Greece, either through extensive trade or possibly because of colonists that settled there and mixed with the native population of the area. That said, Thapsos doesn't have any Cyclopean wall remains, but it does provide a stronger link between the Bronze Age Aegean and Sicily, albeit to the Mycenaeans rather than the legendary Pelasgians. So I guess what I want to figure out during these trips is who built the Cyclopean walls on mainland Italy and in Sicily and when. If they were built during classical antiquity by the Romans and Greeks respectively, then how do we resolve some of the question marks around that? Perhaps there is no mystery at all, since similar construction techniques can spring up independently in different places at different times. Let's see what we can learn from the Cyclopean site at Cefalù. Cefalù, located on the north coast, was founded by the Sicels, one of 3 native tribes that Greek-speaking people discovered on Sicily when they arrived. The Sicels inhabited the eastern part of the island, the Sicani the centre, and the Elymians the west. During the time of Magna Graecia, more than 40 polis, city-states in English, were established on Sicily. In addition to these, many native settlements were influenced by Greek culture. I did a video on a site like this called Segesta near the town of Arice in western Sicily. It was an Elymian city but with a Greek-style temple and amphitheatre and Hellenized art and ceramics. It's not clear what the status of Cefalù was at that time. The historian Thucydides wrote that Himera was the only Greek colony on that coast of Sicily, so Cefalù probably remained as a Siculian settlement, but as is clear from the archaeological record, one that was heavily Hellenized. It did get a Greek name, Kefaloidion. Scholars think it's possible that the Greeks did have some presence there, perhaps a fortification, or a limited population of refugees from Himera later on when that town was destroyed. At Naxos on the east coast, the Cyclopean masonry forms the bottom sections of the earliest defensive walls that enclosed the settlement. By the way, to be clear, the archaeological park is in the modern-day town of Giardini Naxos, but the site itself was called Naxos in classical antiquity because it was settled by colonists from Naxos in the Aegean. It was the earliest site on Sicily to be settled by Greek-speaking colonists. Since the Cyclopean masonry only makes up the first few courses of the walls, it's thought the rest of the walls were made up of mud bricks which have long since collapsed. The stone masonry is around 2 meters high in places, and the mud bricks are estimated to have made up a further 6 meters. These walls are pretty similar to some of the ones on the Italian Peninsula. Here are some examples of polygonal masonry in Lazio on mainland Italy. Near the town of Ferentino, there's a Roman aqueduct with Cyclopean masonry as its foundation. In Palestrina, there are many examples of polygonal masonry. In this photograph, you can see that it forms the bottom part of a building. That building is called the Sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia and covers several artificial terraces cut into the hillside. None of its structure contains Cyclopean masonry except for the bottom section. The sanctuary was built in the 2nd century BCE and was supposedly constructed on top of an older Roman fortification, which explains the presence of the lower courses of Cyclopean masonry. I took this photograph in Palestrina as well. In the foreground you can see a polygonal wall, and behind it, across the modern road, you could see a Roman wall made of the usual rectangular tough blocks. Could it be that the polygonal masonry was used in earlier Roman times and the rectangular blocks were used later? Or maybe it was used for foundations in certain highly seismic areas due to such masonry being stronger. I don't know. Before I started researching for my trip to Cefalù, I assumed that the Cyclopean walls there were defensive enclosure walls just as at Naxos. However, when I read a report from 1831 by the antiquarian George Knott, I was surprised to find the Cyclopean walls there described as being part of a building, probably a house. In fact, that is exactly what the structure looks like, a small house on the slope of a hill. Let's take a look. The modern name given to it is the Temple of Diana, since it's thought to have been built during classical antiquity and to have been a place of ritual. It was first referenced and drawn by Jean-Pierre Louis Laurent Huel, a French painter who travelled to Sicily, Lipari and Malta between 1776 and 1779. Upon his return, he published 4 travel books which included his illustrations of ancient ruins. In 1829, the architects Jacques-Ignace Hittorf and Ludwig von Zandt published a book which featured the Cyclopean building at Cefalù, and in 1831, the clergyman and author George Frederick Knott wrote a detailed description of the building, including a drawing of the layout. In spite of this early interest, the site wasn't officially excavated until the 20th century by Piero Marconi. The building is located on the western slopes of the Rock of Cefalù, a huge limestone outcrop that overlooks the town. It sits at 155 meters above sea level. I took this picture on the way up. It's quite a climb, but really worth it for the scenery and all the other historic remains that are on the hill. The summit of the rock is around 300 meters above sea level and is dominated by the ruins of a Norman castle. There are various remains from medieval times and the early modern period scattered around the hill, including bastions, guard towers, and churches. However, the only ancient structures on the rock are this Cyclopean building and the megalith-covered cistern within it. The facade of the Temple of Diana is 11.5 meters in width and 6.5 meters in height. Its entrance is in a trilithon style with a 2.58 meter long lintel. On entering the building, there's a 7 meter long corridor leading from the doorway to a cistern. When I was there, this was blocked off, so the corridor was pretty short and I couldn't see the cistern. On the left of the corridor, there is one small room, and on the right, there is a larger one. In the Middle Ages, this larger room was turned into part of a church dedicated to Santa Venera. An apsid or room was also built behind it as part of this church and had its own entrance. The corridor leads to a cistern with a depth of 4 meters covered with megalithic stones and supposedly looks a bit like a dolmen. As I say, this wasn't visible when I was there. From what I've read, scholars do think the cistern may be much older than the Cyclopean building. It's possible that it was used as a place of water worship in the Bronze Age or Neolithic. Such practices were common in the Mediterranean at that time. For example, Bronze Age Sardinia has many holy wells and megaron temples, all of which were used to make votive offerings in springs. This is the Megaron Temple at Estesili in Sardinia. I didn't get a chance to visit it when I was there, but I did go to the Pozzo di Santa Cristina, where bronze votive offerings were found during excavations. The Pozzo di Santa Cristina is particularly interesting because some experts think it has solar and lunar alignment. At the Temple of Diana, the system was for the collection of rainwater and apparently didn't connect to a spring. I climbed the hill directly behind the building to get a photograph of its position relative to the sea and to give a semi-aerial overview of it. This pine forest is a modern addition to the slope. In earlier times, there would have been a much clearer view of the sea and the horizon horizon. The gap in the southern wall in the foreground used to be a door that was created during the Middle Ages for access to the church that was built on the site. You can see here how small the rooms are, and I don't think the original blueprint could have been much bigger because it backs right into the hill. Here's another video I took of the site from inside walking out. Now obviously this building does look like those constructed by the Mycenaeans in the Aegean and the Hittites in Anatolia, and both of these civilizations belong to the Bronze Age. Could this building in Cefalù date to that time as well? The plaque at the site talks about an ancient Egyptian artifact dating to the 14th century BCE that was found there. So I looked this up and found a brilliant article on it that was published in 2021 in the Revista del Museo Egizio by the graduate student Claude Laroche and the Egyptologist Gloria Rosati. The story goes like this. In 2004, the original finder of this heart scarab, Andrea Calderazzo, was asked to recall details of his discovery. He couldn't remember exactly when he found it, but says it was either at the end of 1939 or the beginning of 1940. At the time, Andrea was a student and was exploring the Rock of Cefalù with his friends looking for ancient objects. Walking alongside a stream that flowed below the Temple of Diana, he saw the dark green artifact lying in the soil. Since this followed a few days of rain, he thought it possible that the scarab had been washed down from somewhere. A history teacher at his school, who was also an honorary inspector for the Italian Antiquities Service, examined the scarab and wrote an article about it. Eventually, Andrea was asked to give the scarab to the National Museum at Palermo. However, he rejected the 10 liras he was offered for it as being too low an amount. It did eventually end up at the museum though. The scarab is made of green diorite. 7 lines of text are inscribed on its base, which also has a lunette above the text containing the image of Anubis as a recumbent jackal. Most of the text is legible and starts with the line Anubis who is in the embalming place. It then mentions the name of the owner of the scarab and proceeds with the beginning of chapter BD 30b of the Book of the Dead. The scarab has been dated based on style and paleographic details to sometime between the 19th and 22nd dynasty, that is between 1189 and 716 BCE. That's quite a broad time range which covers the Bronze Age, the Iron Age and Classical Antiquity. However, based on its similarity to other scarabs, such as one in the Berlin Museum and one that came from a well-dated archaeological context at Heracleopolis Magna, it's most likely that it dates to the 22nd dynasty. Scarabs are unusual outside of Egypt, but interestingly, another heart scarab can be viewed at the Mandraliska Museum in Cefalù. Made of yellow-brown steatite and containing traces of red pigment, it was in the collection of Enrico Paraino, Baron of Mandralisco in the 19th century. Based on its features, it has also been dated to around the 21st or 22nd dynasties. Its provenance is unknown, but it was probably acquired from Egypt in modern times. The scarab found near the Cyclopean building may have reached Cefalù via Punic trade and may or may not have had a connection to the temple. But in any case, since experts think it dates to classical antiquity, it's not evidence of a Bronze Age origin for the temple, as stated on the plaque. And even if it was Bronze Age, it may have reached Cefalù at a much later date. The information plaque also talks about the temple being aligned with the equinoxes and the planet Venus. So I wanted to know more about that. I found a paper that was published in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry in 2016, where Andrea Orlando and Davide Gori analysed the temple's alignments. The temple faces west, and using both satellite data from Google Earth and on-site measurements, the researchers found that the azimuth of the entrance of the Temple of Diana is about 270 degrees. This means that the entrance and the corridor which leads to the dolmen-covered cistern have an east-west orientation and are equinoctial, facing the setting sun on the equinoxes. Because of the pine forest, the authors of the paper were not able to view the setting sun on the western horizon from the temple, so carried out a 3D reconstruction using architectural photogrammetry to do this. They didn't mention anything to do with the planet Venus. I can't find any research on that particular claim made by the plaque. This orientation also doesn't really support an older age for the monument. Such alignments have been found at extremely ancient megalithic sites, but also at many of the temples from classical antiquity. It does, however, support the idea of it having been a sacred building rather than a house. The general consensus seems to be that the temple was built during the classical era as a place of worship for a water cult, and that the cistern and dolmen are actually much older, so the builders of the Cyclopean temple were just adding to an area that was already of ancient importance. The authors of the archaeoastronomical paper give other examples of buildings dedicated to water cults. Close to the town of Acciareale near Catania, there are the remains of a sacred bath complex called Santa Venera al Pozzo. Due to a thermal spring and stream running through the area, the bath complex was built in the 5th century BCE and dedicated to Demeter and Kore. The therapeutic properties of thermal waters were well known and exploited during classical antiquity. At Cefalù, there's nothing to suggest it was a bath complex. It wasn't connected to a thermal spring and was far too small. It may have been used for votive offerings, but once again, the fact that it contains a system which collected rainwater rather than a well connected to a spring seems unusual in that respect. Also, it doesn't seem that any objects that could have been votive offerings were found there during excavations. In fact, I'm not really sure what was found there during the initial excavation because the report isn't available online. But from what I understand, there was really nothing there. However, the man who found the Egyptian heart scarab said that it was near a stream. I didn't see or hear a stream up there and can't find anything on Google Earth, but maybe there used to be one and perhaps it somehow fed into the cistern. I don't know, just putting an idea out there. Its position halfway up the slope and its small size mean it probably wasn't a defensive structure. I did read that there's also some Cyclopean masonry on the seafront, but didn't manage to find it. There's just a couple of very vague references to it and a few pictures which aren't terribly clear. I would need to walk around the whole promontory to find it, I think, but I didn't have the time. I'm really fascinated as to how the site has been reused over the years. It started off as a dolmen-covered cistern before a Cyclopean structure was built around it for a water court, and then during the Middle Ages the temple was altered to accommodate a church dedicated to Santa Venera. This reuse and remodeling of sacred buildings is a common feature in history. Sometimes it was because a place had meaning and was connected to the ancestors, so subsequent cultures held it in reverence. Sometimes it was for practical reasons because it was easier to remodel a pre-existing structure than to build a new one. And sometimes it was to remove all traces of the pagan past. I still think the Cyclopean masonry is a mystery. I do still wonder if there might be a link to the Bronze Age, but I certainly can't find any evidence for it through my amateur lens. If I get the time, I'll go back to Cefalù to see if I can find the Cyclopean masonry that supposedly lines the seafront, because if that really is there, it's truly mind-boggling. I'm going to keep researching and visiting more of these sites, so stay with me if they interest you as much as they interest me. Thank you for watching, everyone. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. A big special thank you goes out to my patrons and channel members, and I'll see you next time.